Yeah, welcome to this podcast. We are joined today by Professor Cameron Harwick, who is an economist in New York with interest in monetary theory, institutional evolution, and folk music. He is an associate professor of economics at State University of New York, Brockport. He is interested in how humans coordinate with each other using tools like money, language, and norms. And his research work uses tools like macroeconomics, game theory, and computational modeling. So the subject of discussion for this podcast will be two papers that he wrote. The first is titled "Bubbles and Broad Monetary Aggregates Toward a Consensus Approach to Business Cycles." This was published in Eastern Economic Journal. And the next paper is a chapter that was published. And so this chapter was titled Finance in a Theory of Money. Yeah, welcome to this podcast, Cameron.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, for doing this. So, Cameron, why don't you, begin by talking about, yourself, your upbringing, and where you raised in the US, and what was the sort of motivation or any influence, that you had that actually led you to pursue a career in being an economist. Yeah, Cameron.
Yeah, so I grew up in North Carolina. I started out in political science actually because that's one of the unfortunate things about American high school education is that you get the impression that uh, that really politics is the organizing principle of how things work. And so I quickly realized going into college that political science is not a real field. It's three fields in a trench coat.
Yeah,
Uh, but economics, immediately with the first class, I realized this is what I'm looking for. And since then, it's been uh, such a fruitful way of looking at the world, for understanding things in terms of incentives. Later on, I did get kind of frustrated with the formalism of that. And I found myself after graduating reading a lot of economics, realized that a lot of the papers I got the most out of were by authors at George Mason.
yeah,
So it was kind of a no-brainer for me to go there. What I love about that is that there's a real excitement about economics. A lot of places will kind of squeeze that out of you in grad school, but
yeah.
it really cultivates the excitement of learning how to understand the world, and that's what I really appreciate about that approach.
Yeah, and so George Mason actually gives you a rather different, view of how economics is done, because it's considered a non-orthodox research program. Is that correct, Cameron?
Yeah, what I appreciate about the Mason approach, and it's difficult for me to imagine being excited about economics any other way of doing things, is that it's theory first. And that's been kind of unfashionable in the past. There's a Henrich and Muthakrishna retrospective on the replication crisis in empirical psychology, where they say that why have these empirical fields imploded so much is because, well, we didn't worry as much as we should have about theory. We didn't nail down the concepts before we went to the data.
Yeah,
And that's really the approach that Mason takes, is nail down the concepts, then we can go to the data, then we can understand the data.
yeah. So it's not a methodology-driven research program. Because other
Right.
PhD programs are more of, learning the methodology and then, tweaking the empirical, but
And
it's
of course,
more,
there's some of
yeah,
that, and
yeah,
that is valuable, or it can be valuable, I should say, because if you focus on the empirical methodology without the concepts,
yeah,
then
yes,
and
yeah,
and we'll talk later today about a lot of the ways that that's failed in
yeah,
economics.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so George Mason in particular is an Austrian school, school of thought. It's one of the two universities in the US. other being Auburn University, right? So it,
Right.
yeah,
And I would, I would not necessarily cop to that label just because there's so much good and bad. But what I do appreciate about the Austrian approach is the theory first way of doing economics. And of course, that doesn't always necessarily go in directions that I would uh, feel good about, but I do think that it's as a broad approach to economics, I find it very useful.
because it actually allows you to trace the evolution of, the economic thought process, right? So I think that is very critical, correct? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
You're not just you're very focused on real world reference, right? If you
yeah,
read a lot of theory papers in mainstream macro, you're kind of wondering like where's the real world reference here?
yeah,
And, sometimes you can get too hung up on that, but on the other hand, with the Austrian approach, you're never left wondering like what's really going on here? How does this like where are the real people in this model?
yeah. And the other thing which I mean, we will get to in some of the questions to follow is that, people, economists of, like the previous generation, their writing is very, very objective and they write, to the point, research
Mhm.
people, right? Because it's easy for you to follow as an economist, right?
Yeah,
So,
there's definitely a way that graduate training can make you a worse writer.
yeah, yeah. So Cameron, we come now, to the next question. And this is, very objective analysis of, the Austrian business cycle theory.
Mhm.
That focus, I mean, so they focus on artificially cheap credit initiating malinvestment over the course of the boom, which,
Mhm.
must be liquidated during the burst as the not natural rate of interest reasserts itself. Now, you have a paper on this, right? Where you talk about, the structure of production framework and that the investment in, industries which are far away down the, the supply chain are more
Mhm.
sensitive to changes in, interest rate. Is that, yeah. So can you, yeah, throw some light here?
Well, that's the orthodox Austrian business cycle story, which my paper actually criticizes.
Yeah,
Um, the structure of production framework you can imagine as all capital being goods in progress. So a brick or a piece of steel that goes through successive stages and then gets mined, refined, cast, installed, and finally sold as a final consumer good.
yeah,
Um, and this was intended by Hayek came up with this as kind of a pedagogical example of how interest rate malinvestments could in principle work. Now the problem is that most capital is actually not like that. And a lot of the important capital in an economy is durable capital,
yeah,
things that you can't just attribute certain units of output to certain units of input because it gives you a whole stream of output over time.
yeah,
This would be things like tools, factories, things like that.
yeah. I mean, even things like which we use in our daily lives, right? Tangible stuff, we use in our daily lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yes, yeah,
mean, one would hope one doesn't have to
yeah,
buy all the productive things at the point of use all the time.
yeah,
Um, so the issue with when we think about durable capital, all of a sudden the stages of production construct really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And Hayek knew this and really struggled with this in the pure theory of capital, didn't really adequately solve this problem. But there's been a lot of work. Um, Lewin and Kaczynowski have a lot of papers where they introduce this idea of financial duration,
okay,
which you can think of as the interest elasticity of the present value of an investment project. How much does the value of a project change when the interest rate rises or falls.
Okay.
And what that captures is the potential for these kind of interest rate driven malinvestments. Now, the problem is once you start thinking in terms of financial duration rather than the sort of roundaboutness construct, the actual Austrian story looks a lot different. So the Austrian story in its canonical form really depends on kind of the particulars that don't really generalize. Um, and what I show in this paper that you mentioned is that interest rate induced capital malinvestment just is not enough to explain actual depressions. You need some sort of aggregate demand explanation. And now you can bring those together to some extent, but you're not going to be able to do without an aggregate demand explanation.
Okay. Okay. So is this, connected to, the main assumption of, the most business cycle approaches where they sort of start off with the, the aggregate demand and supply being in equilibrium, and then sort of, things diverging from there. Uh, this one.
Yeah, and so the question then would be, I think the big difference in a lot of the business cycle approaches is how does that aggregate demand get out of whack in the first place? And the canonical Austrian story doesn't really think about that kind of at all, right? Aggregate demand is supposed to not be that important. And this
Yeah.
kind of gets us down to, later on we'll talk about the credit cycle and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
quantity theory approaches. So
Yeah.
we can talk about some of that there. But yeah, a big part of the question is how does aggregate demand move? Is it just a question of monetary policy, or can it move endogenously through money supply or money demand?
Yeah. Yes. So we will come to that in great details, but I think I will actually ask you about the economist, Leland Yeager. Yeager, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly,
Mhm.
but he was one of the foremost, exponents of the Austrian school. Is that correct, Cameron?
I don't think Yeager would call himself an Austrian, although he certainly engaged with the Austrian thinkers, but I think he himself was not.
Okay, and so he has this, book which is titled, "The Fluttering Whale: Essays on Monetary Disequilibrium." And so there are four parts to this book. Part one is monetary disequilibrium and its consequences. Part two is monetary misconceptions. Part three is Keynesianism and other diversions. Part four is avoiding monetary disequilibrium. I have a
Mhm.
quote from one of the part that I will ask you in my next question, but then I would, like you to talk about him in some detail because you actually, refer to his books quite a many, places in your paper, Cameron, and the book also. But I have
Mhm.
read it and it sort of is, cutting across many of, I like it goes straight to the point, I was like I was telling you, these writers, they are very crisp in, what they are writing and how they're writing it. And the point they want the reader to grab. Yeah.
Mhm. And yeah, I think you've picked up on the same thing that I appreciate about Yeager, which is that he's a very clear writer. He's somebody who I think, and this inspires some of my approach too, somebody who wants to cut through a controversy by breaking it down into the simplest possible pieces
Yeah.
and then building back up to an answer until he's satisfied. And so a lot of the times that gives you kind of the best statement of a position that exists. For example, the cash balance interpretation of depression, which is in that compilation you mentioned.
Yeah.
It's saying a lot of the same things as a lot of the classical monetarists, but in my opinion, it does so much more simply, straightforwardly, in a way that, coming from zero context, you could get a good sense of what the actual mechanics of the business cycle are.
Yeah.
Um, he has another essay, Individual and Overall Viewpoints in Monetary Economics, which is a very basic point, but it's such a good statement of the point that you just keep coming back to it over and over. Basically, that thinking of things from my perspective as an individual in the economy looks very different from looking at things from an overall perspective where, for example, assets and liabilities are going to net out in an overall perspective where they don't from my perspective.
Yeah.
And what that means is that a lot of the representative agent models of macroeconomics are not going to generalize, right? Because you're kind of mixing up those individual and overall viewpoints.
Yes.
So that's something I keep coming back to and thinking about, for example, what does savings mean?
Yeah.
What is the role of liquidity in an economy?
Yeah.
And the
What
usefulness
is,
of Yeager, sorry.
I'm saying, I mean, what exactly is the meaning between, when we say money supply and money demand are not equal, right? What does
Mhm.
so you actually have a paragraph on this idea, right? And just talk about this idea. When money supply or money demand is greater than money supply, right? So,
Yeah, so that's Yeager's whole idea of monetary disequilibrium in this section is that as an individual, I can build up my money balances
yes,
by not spending, but then other people have to spend uh, in a compensating direction
yes,
so that I have something to accumulate.
yeah,
The problem being that if everybody's trying to build up their money balances, where do those come from if those are not accommodated by monetary policy? That's what forces down the price level. That's what leads to the short run real effects.
yeah. And so you don't want there to be too much of a disequilibrium between money supply and money demand. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, because that short run disequilibrium, it is short run, but it's going to have, or it can have, major self-feeding effects in that short run.
Yeah. But so when we talk of monetary disequilibrium, I think that word monetary means money. And so I think it's very important that, we have a basic premise of, how we define money. And so you are
Mhm.
being very cautious or circumspect, should I say that, when you do that in your paper, right?
Mhm.
So I will quote, you say that to call something money is not to make a statement about the good itself, but about the expectations in a community that might lead individuals in it to employ the good at a certain juncture in their plans. So we are thinking money not like as good, right? As a
Right.
tangible, good, right? And so this aggregate, I mean, if we ultimately, measure money like this, then this would carry the meaning of total nominal value of liquidity services being provided in the economy. So this
Mm.
is the way you define money is actually, how you also define liquidity, right?
Yeah. Mhm. Liquidity is the service provided by money, I would say.
Yeah, but then that service also depends upon, the expectation, which is what you're talking about. So yeah, so why don't you, throw some light on this?
Yeah, so kind of connecting this to the last question, this is me grappling with a claim by Yeager. Um, and what's so great about Yeager is that even when you disagree with him, it's very, very fruitful to think through why. So Yeager has this paper, Essential Properties of the Medium of Exchange, which is in this compendium also,
Yeah,
where he wants to draw a bright line between here's money, here's not money,
yeah,
and what makes something money versus not money. And throughout this paper, he's thinking of money as some particular good that we use as a medium of exchange. And what I'm doing in this paragraph that you mentioned is I'm saying, what if we don't do that? What if we don't start with the assumption that money is a particular good? So part of what I'm doing, this is part of that theory first,
yeah,
approach to monetary economics that I mentioned
Right.
earlier. And
That
so,
goes all the way back to Menger's, conjectural account of the origin of money, right? Out of
yeah, and we can talk about that a little bit because
a
I think
little
that
later. Yeah,
leads
yeah,
us
yeah,
astray a
totally.
little
Yeah,
bit too.
yeah,
Um, but what I'm trying to do here is to define money as rigorously as possible in terms of categories of choice. So early on, there's an early Hayek paper where he talks about what makes something an economic good. What's the difference between a chair and a non-chair?
yeah,
And it's nothing physical about the good itself or the object itself, but it's how we use it. As economists, we don't care about physical things at all, right? We care about the wants and needs that they satisfy
yes,
and about the relation that they hold to people's intentions and plans.
yes,
So if we apply the same logic to money, everybody knows the definition of money as a medium of exchange, right?
yeah,
But let's go a step further because medium of exchange, there's a lot packed in there. Because medium of exchange means not only I can spend it, but it also means other people will accept it, right?
yes,
And so then we have to ask, why would people accept it? And so what we come to is that in order for anything to be money, there has to be a structure of expectations throughout the whole economy that we've coordinated on some good or set of goods even uh, that we will accept in exchange for things, right?
yeah, yeah,
Because now indirect exchange is now a part of a routine part of people's plans in an economy to coordinate resource use, as opposed to, and I have another couple of papers on this, contrasting monetary exchange as an institution, as opposed to, for example, kin networks as an
okay,
institution for allocating resources.
yeah, yeah. So when you say institutions, you mean institutions which is like which are like these banking networks, right? Cameron, institution.
Yeah. So what counts as an institution? And that's one of the big fundamental questions in institutional economics too. I would define institutions uh, as a routine, recurring uh, mode of interaction. And so we have expectations that when I interact with you this way, you're going to respond this way. When I give you money, you're going to accept that and give me a good or service. When we schedule a Zoom call, maybe Zoom, a podcast would be
Yeah, yeah.
a kind of institution, right? Because now we've structured the way we're interacting with each other. We have mutual expectations.
Or should I say you're coordinating with each other? Coordinating.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so institutions are basically a way for people to coordinate with each other. Now, what we usually colloquially think of institutions like banking institutions, Doug North has a paper where he talks about institutions versus organizations. Um, and, we're not usually very rigorous about that distinction, but organizations are going to be, a formal structure of control. And that might correspond better to what you were talking about with
Yeah,
banking
yeah, 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 yeah. So I was actually referring maybe to an organization of the banking, the evolution of the banking institutions where all these investment banks have, come into the picture, right?
Right.
Right. So yeah, so we will get to it. Maybe so I just want to, quote Leland Yeager again here now. And I think this is very important because, anyone who is listening to this podcast, they should actually know who a monetarist, really is, right? And so he
Mhm.
has, this quote, which is I have taken from part two. I think it's the first chapter of part two, which is monetary misconceptions. So he says that a monetarist is an economist convinced by the evidence that the quantity of money and changes in it dominate the total flow of spending in an economy. The government budget and so-called real factors in the economy, including investment incentives, are distinctly subordinate influences when not paralleled by behavior of the money supply. The view attributed to monetarists that only money matters is a straw man invented by critics. The monetarist view of what determines total spending is rather that money matters most. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to this, Cameron? Well, I think this sums up very well, right?
Yeah, I think this is a fine definition. And there is, people think about monetarism as associated with the equation of exchange, MV equals PY.
Yeah.
And that's tautologically true, right?
Yes.
That just tells us that income equals expenditures. But tautologies are useful when they help us slice up observations of the world in useful ways. And frankly, if velocity or the money or the demand for money were erratic and all over the place, the equation of exchange would still be true,
Yes.
but it wouldn't be very useful for us because it's not slicing up the world in useful ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where the profession sort of settled right now, right? They see that the velocity of M2 since the late 70s, early 80s, kind of all over the place, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the now standard new Keynesian framework kind of arose out of that. We've talked about there was a pair of op-eds in 1983. Milton Friedman wrote one and Bill Barnett wrote one
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
same day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Friedman's looking at M2
Yeah.
and said, "Oh my gosh, M2 is exploding. We're going to see a return of inflation." And
Yeah.
Barnett says, "Well, no, probably not, right? M2 might not be the right thing to be looking at."
Yes.
Unfortunately, Friedman was wrong. Well, I mean, fortunately, we didn't get inflation, but unfortunately, because what that did is it
Yeah.
kind of discredited this view that money really matters. Even though there were people at the time who were saying, hey, maybe this is not the right money to be looking at. So this is one place that the rubber really hits the road on this theory first approach, because the monetary aggregates we're usually looking at, like M2,
Yeah.
don't make a whole lot of conceptual sense. And Friedman kind of knew this, right? There's brief places in the monetary history, the 1960 book, where he kind of hints at this, but mostly it's a punt, right? He likes M2 because up to that point, M2 had good statistical fit.
Yes.
And so if you look at this, if you build your monetarist theory with a statistics first approach like this,
Yeah.
it breaks down. It's gonna break down. And it did break down in the 80s. And that's why there are not a lot of monetarists anymore, because the proper way of thinking about the money supply has not gained as much currency, no pun intended, as
Maybe,
one would hope.
maybe we can say that, the way that, the liquidity is being defined, or maybe the orthodox way in which, liquidity was defined has not served the profession well, right?
Exactly. I think a lot of times people aren't even thinking about liquidity services. People are just thinking about the money supply as just a stock of dollars
Yes.
or whatever other currency.
Yes.
And liquidity services is just completely implicit, if at best.
So M2 in that case leads to an overestimation of the liquidity services, right?
Not even, it could go either way, right?
Okay.
Because on the one hand, M2 has some somewhat illiquid things like mutual funds in it that should not count as much as they do. But on the other hand,
Okay.
M2 is also missing a lot of things that provide some liquidity services.
Okay.
And so I could imagine at various points it could be an underestimate or an overestimate.
Okay. It can be the both. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So, we're talking about this. So there are sort of, two approaches how you approach, business cycle. One is, quantity theoretic approach, which I think sort of makes sense now that, we've talked about, how it can make sense. And
Mhm.
there is this, credit cycle approaches, right? So yeah. So can you talk a little bit about, the credit cycle approaches?
Yeah. So that distinction comes from Bob Hetzel, and these are basically
You mean
two ways.
Robert Hetzel, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Uh, Basically two ways of explaining the business cycle. So the quantity theory, or what he calls the quantity theory approach, is something like your standard aggregate demand story, where sometimes the central bank's going to overshoot relative to money demand, sometimes it's going to undershoot, and you get a recession. Credit cycle theories, on the other hand, are going to tell a much more micro story. Usually these are going to center in financial or credit markets.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different varieties, right?
Yeah.
In my paper, I classify both the traditional Austrian story as well as the traditional Keynesian story are both credit cycle stories. Um, so there's a lot of different varieties, but they're all going to tend to see interest rates as the transmission mechanism. And the money supply is, or money demand is going to be less important, right? And so it's another way of slicing up these observations.
Yeah.
So what I do in this bubbles and broad money aggregates paper is I use this constructive definition of money where we define the money supply as the total value of liquidity services in an economy, regardless of what asset uh, provides those services. And we can tally those up, and we can talk later about how that actually happens. But by defining money that way, what we can do is we can connect these sort of micro movements in financial markets to aggregate demand in general. And these things are going to affect not just money demand, but even the money supply as well, because a lot of that is not under the direct control of monetary policy. It's kind of under the indirect control of monetary policy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Cameron. So I come back, to the next question, which is we were talking about this very briefly, which is connected with Karl Menger's 1892, a conjectural account of the origin of money out of barter exchange, where he focused on the process by which a single good becomes far and far away more saleable or
Hmm.
liquid than other goods. Yeah, so what exactly is he talking about, Cameron, here, Carl Mengers?
Yeah, so Menger's so Menger tells a story where we start in a barter economy. We're trading goods for goods.
Yeah,
And the problem we run into is that in order to make a trade, not only do I have to have something that you want, but you have to have something that I want. And that's inconvenient because how often is that going to happen? And so Menger tells a story where people in this economy are going to look for the most saleable good. And even if I don't want it, maybe we'll pick shells or something.
yeah,
Even if I don't want shells, I know other people want shells. And so then I want to acquire them so I can get the things that I need. And then all of a sudden, I'm willing to accept shells, and now I'm one more person who accepts shells. And by the end of the day, everybody's coordinated on this idea of shells, or some good as money, as the most saleable good.
yeah,
Now, I think there's a good and a bad aspect to this story. The good aspect is that what Menger does here is he focuses us on what money does. Money, the service that money provides is its salability, and what I call in this paper liquidity, right? Liquidity is salability. It's
yeah.
the ability to accomplish an exchange with some good, right?
So we can say that is the primary function of what money is supposed to do.
I think so, yeah. Um, and money is not only a medium. I think it's a tautology to say that any medium of exchange is going to be money, at least to some degree or another. And we'll talk about how we exactly disentangle that
Yeah,
later, I guess.
yeah, yeah,
And Menger also shows that this is an incentive compatible process, right? Nobody has to direct this. This is kind of something that everybody has an incentive to coordinate on. Once you're part of a monetary network,
Yeah.
it doesn't do you any good to break from that. Now, I do think the limitation of the Menger story, two limitations. First of all, this story, of course, is ahistorical. It's a thought experiment. It's not an actual history, just because the barter economy that he describes could not possibly ever exist. It would spontaneously sprout money, as he talked about, very, very quickly before it was even established as a barter economy.
Yeah.
So for the actual history, we'll have to take another approach, and I have other papers about that. But more importantly for us, a lot of people have taken Menger's story to imply that there will be one good that
Yes.
that we coalesce around, and that one good will be money. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
you well, you mentioned this Krosner quote.
Yeah.
Krosner talks about the fact that even though money, or whatever money good this Mengerian process centers around, that becomes more and more and more saleable as people join the monetary network.
Yeah.
But Krosner's point is that that also makes other things more saleable too.
Yes.
And so it's not like other saleability decreases. So think about it this way. If I want to sell a bicycle, because we live in a money economy, we can calculate what's the value of this bicycle.
Yes.
And then I can ask, if you want to bake me some bread, how many loaves of bread is going to be about equivalent value to this bicycle? Now, we're not using money. We're bartering. We're trading goods for goods. But the
Yeah.
only way that it's feasible to barter is because we live in a monetary economy where we have that unit of account, right?
Yes.
So now all of a sudden, money has become more saleable itself. Money is universally saleable, but it's also made bread and bicycles more saleable, even in barter transactions.
Yes.
And I think this is really important for understanding financial markets because, the kind of a trivial or unimportant example if we're trading goods for goods, but this is not trivial if we're talking about financial assets, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so
So
you
there's
mentioned
all.
Krosner, right? So he was, I think, skeptical about that the way we, define or the way we, use money might actually bring
Mhm.
about the end of money itself as a medium of exchange. But it might actually increase marketability of other goods, which is, financial assets. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, and what's funny is that, Krosner mentions this as kind of like a hypothetical possibility. And Yeager even has a paper with Greenfield where he talks about some, hypothetical futuristic economy where we can separate the medium of exchange from the unit of account. But we kind of already live in that economy,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
There's not one thing that we use as a medium of exchange. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this broader project, there's no sharp distinction between money substitutes or money non-money, right?
Yes.
There's a whole gradient of things that substitute better or things that provide more liquidity services,
Yeah.
things that provide fewer but still some liquidity services. If they help you exchange, that's liquidity services.
Yeah.
And so even things like treasury bonds, right, are used as collateral in a lot of financial transactions.
Yes.
That's not as liquid as cash. You can't
Yes.
spend that at Walmart, but you are doing monetary like transactions with it. And so it seems like that ought to count to some extent
Yes.
in our measure of the money supply. That's liquidity services, right?
Yes. I think in his book, Barnett, page 118 of the book, he sort
Mhm.
of conjectures this high-end financial assets as, Ferrari, right? And so when he says that, so I'm just quoting here now. So when he says that when clearly the price of Ferrari is too high if valued solely for its transportation services, and
Mhm.
Ferrari cannot be solely for recreation. since Ferraris are seen on public highways, right? Ferraris must be a joint product providing both kind of services. The same has been true of money, since many monetary assets began yielding interest long ago. Yes, and we are talking about the liquidity, which you have actually talked about, and the other is investment return, which is the financial assets, right?
Mhm.
Investment return is actually not monetary services.
Right.
Or we can say it's not liquid, right? It's not liquidity, investment return. Yeah, Cameron.
And the Ferrari example is such a good example because it shows that we have the tools in economics. We've always had the tools to think about these kind of joint goods that provide multiple kinds of services, and their price reflects
Yeah,
multiple services that they provide. And suddenly we just forget that when we think about money as just its own
yeah,
isolated kind of good.
yeah. So in this case, we are overestimating the liquidity services when you're talking about broader monetary aggregates, right?
M2 is going to overestimate the liquidity of things like mutual funds and then underestimate things like treasury bonds.
Or maybe it's underestimating liquidity,
Yeah.
the broader, the broader monetary aggregates. Yeah, and so yeah, so so another economist which connects to this is Perry Mehrling, right?
Mhm.
So he has a paper on the asset liability structure of the money, right? So he has this the hierarchical structure of is actually of critical importance over the business cycle, as the quantity of each layer uh, you know constrains the issue of assets in the layer above, right? So why
Mhm.
don't we talk about this?
Yeah, so this is an idea with some pedigree, but Mehrling, like Yeager, has just such a good, straightforward statement of this. So that's what I jump off from in this paper. So the idea here is that you have what's called the pyramid of credit. And this is a way of cutting through, a lot of older economists had tried to distinguish, what's money, what's credit. And Mehrling is trying to address that. So Mehrling's idea is that you have an asset liability structure in financial markets.
Yeah,
That at the base you have base money, which is why it's called base money.
yeah,
That is an asset to everybody and a liability to nobody.
yeah,
On top of base money, you have bank issued money. This is going to be your deposit balances and things like that.
yeah,
This is an asset to you, but a liability to your bank. And so what the bank does is, because of fractional reserve banking, the bank is actually going to be able to issue a larger quantity of deposit balances than the base money that supports it. And so you get a small base, and then you have this inverted pyramid with
yes,
um, with bank deposits on top of that.
yes,
And Mehrling kind of generalizes this story, right? Because that's a very old idea. But in addition to that, those bank deposits, you also have further layers of this pyramid that expand and expand and expand based on leverage ratios. You have, for example, investment banks will redeem to you in terms of bank deposits, right? They will wire money to your bank. They won't give you cash.
yeah,
They will redeem in terms of bank deposits. And then they will issue their own liabilities on the basis of that. And it will be a higher quantity, but less liquidity.
yeah,
And what the usefulness of this is that it gives us a way of talking about the endogeneity of the credit structure, right? Because what happens if the supply of base money contracts? Well, the layer above it, the bank deposits, has to contract even more than in proportion if banks try to maintain a certain reserve ratio. And this is what's in the past been called the perverse elasticity of credit. When the demand for it goes up, the
yeah,
supply actually goes down because of this kind of pyramiding. And that's same thing's going to be happening in the upper layers too. We can kind of see this in 2008,
Yeah,
right? The upper layers contracted a lot because of a small contraction in the lower layers that reverberates and expands, and so you get a larger contraction than you otherwise would.
yeah,
And for me, this is a way of connecting uh, the credit cycle and the quantity theory explanations for business cycles that we talked about earlier. And
yeah,
Mehrling doesn't do this, but what I want to do is I want to think about the liquidity services provided by all of the layers of the pyramid.
yeah,
And if we do that, guess what? That contraction we talked about, that's going to be a contraction in the money supply and not just money demand, right?
yeah. But I think the idea of this actually goes back historically to the work of Ralph Hawtrey in the
Mm-hmm.
1920s, because he has his book Currency and Credit.
Mm-hmm.
We will not talk about that here, but it actually, the origin of it lies in this book. And so because you're mentioning that the divisor aggregates are a way of reconciling this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, I mean, your paper was dedicated to this issue, right? So yeah, so why don't you talk about the conceptual underpinnings of divisor aggregates in the way that the asset liability structure is designed, Cameron.
Yeah. So this is where we are actually able to take our conceptual idea of what the money supply ought to measure in terms of people's actual plans, choices, and expectations, and now we have a guide to how we take that to the data.
Yeah,
And divisor aggregation is basically a way of doing justice to that definition without assuming a singular money asset. So your example of the Ferrari was actually a really good example. Divisor aggregation is a way of pulling apart these kind of joint assets. So if we think of a Ferrari as providing joint status services, transportation services, it's kind of stylish, right?
yeah,
What if we were able to pull out the transportation services and aggregate that with the transportation services of a bus
yeah,
or
yeah,
a of anything else, a sedan,
yeah,
and then we
maybe
could,
walking.
or even walking, yeah.
Yeah,
And all of these are ways of providing transportation services.
yeah,
And so we could come up with a price index for transportation,
yeah,
but we don't want to put the whole value of a Ferrari in there because that's a large part of that is not about the transportation.
yeah,
So basically, what a divisor aggregate is going to do is do the same thing for the money supply, right? Because there are some things that are mostly money. This is going to be the cash, right?
yeah,
No investment return. And then there's going to be other things like treasury bonds or money market mutual funds that do give me a return. There's some investment there, but it's also liquidity.
yes,
And so the idea here is what would make me willing to accept a lower than the market rate return on some asset? Why would I hold something if it's making me less than the risk-free rate?
yeah,
And the answer here is because it's providing implicit liquidity services.
yes,
And so that kind of arbitrage logic allows us to pull apart investment on the one hand, liquidity on the other hand, and we can take liquidity from all these other assets and aggregate that into a at least an index, not a dollar value, but an index over time of the liquidity services in an economy,
yeah,
regardless of what asset is providing those liquidity services. And I think that's going to be a lot more economically meaningful as a money aggregate than something like M2 that just, takes this and this and your Ferraris and your Nissans or something and adds them together.
yeah. So the link, I mean, was lost during the 1980s. M2 was the standard go-to measure of money supply during Friedman days, right?
Yep.
1960s and 70s.
Which is exactly what we should expect, right?
Yeah,
Prior to the 60s and 70s, there was something called Regulation Q in the United States that that limited the investment services that a lot of these assets could provide. It was basically a cap on the interest rate for a lot of these assets.
okay, okay,
And so the effect of that was to make sure that it was to prohibit a lot of these joint investment and liquidity assets. And so you had, investment assets on the one hand, liquid assets on the other,
yeah,
and you could not really combine them legally. When that was repealed, of course, M2 is not going to be as sensible an aggregate anymore,
yeah,
just because now you get a lot more financial innovation, you get a lot more of these joint assets. And if you're just adding them together in a simple sum kind of way,
yeah,
that's going to get less and less, that's going to track liquidity services less and less well as we innovate financially more and more.
yeah. You use the word vitiates its economic meaningfulness in your paper.
What economic meaningfulness?
I mean, the economic meaningfulness of, the money, uh, the aggregates, monetary
Yeah,
aggregates.
exactly. Because we want our empirical aggregates to correspond to something meaningful. And what does meaningful mean? Meaningful means in terms of the choices, plans, and expectations of the people actually in the economy. And M2
Uh,
just has not been that since the end of a lot of these financial regulations in the US.
yeah. So, this is, connected with, the network structure in the construction of monetary aggregates, across
Mhm.
countries. So you draw some, literature on this also in your paper. So what are these network structures, Cameron?
Yeah. So in the chapter that you had mentioned earlier, I think of the asset liability structure of the economy, um, not as a pyramid, but as a way of generalizing this idea that the pyramid is this inverted pyramid that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Same sort of idea, but generalized. In the same sort of way as the structure of production was never supposed to be a general model of the entire economy because you just can't operationalize that.
Okay.
And similarly, the pyramid of credit that we talked about earlier, it's a great way of explaining things,
Yeah.
but you can't really operationalize that in empirical work because it's too simple.
Okay.
So what we don't see is financial institutions issuing one kind of asset redeemable for an asset below it in the pyramid. Right? We see some of that. That's kind of one way of understanding what fractional reserve banking does. But especially once we get up here into the upper layers, we see very, very complex sorts of securitization. We see lots of diversification and bundling. And we even see less liquid assets, like mortgages,
Yeah.
being securitized and packaged and reissued as something that would be in the pyramid above it, but it's actually more liquid because you've diversified away a lot of the risk.
Okay.
And so it's not so simple as a pyramid structure, but if we think of it as a network structure, that lets us do justice to the complexity of this structure across institutions, across country borders, even.
Uh-huh.
That lets us use certain tools in network analysis and also operationalize this for empirical research. Right now that we've nailed down the concepts, now
Yeah.
we have the right tools to apply. Now we
Yeah.
can do that.
Yeah. And so one way in which you draw attention to this, that it can be used is, to measure, the inflation of the OECD countries.
Mhm.
And so this was, so in an empirical paper, Cesarelli and Mojon observed that the inflation of 22 OECD countries have a common factor that accounts for nearly 70% of the variance. Variance fluctuations at business cycle frequencies. So this you say is linked with the network structures of the measuring of liquidity, right? Or there's
Mhm.
already some empirical evidence on this in the way that how they are connected to each other.
Yeah. So what you're referring to is this weird result that a few different economists have been grappling with for a while, that domestic inflation in a lot of countries is actually not very well predicted by the money supply in that country. What it's predicted better by is global liquidity. If you
Okay.
take some measure of M2 across all different countries, that actually predicts domestic inflation better than domestic M2 in a lot of places. And that's a little puzzling, right? And so there's a lot of models and empirical papers trying to figure out what exactly is going on here.
Yeah.
What I suggest in the end of my chapter is that thinking of the network structure of financial markets across countries and aggregating correctly the liquidity services of a lot of the issues of these institutions or organizations is going to or can suggest an explanation for this. And I've floated this explanation to some of these economists, and they all tell me, the data's not there. You've told me that a lot of places are actually there is a lot better data now for divisi
Yeah.
aggregates in a lot of countries that there
Yeah. Yeah.
wasn't 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Slowly it's becoming, more accessible, data.
So I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that this will be testable in the near future. But the idea here would be that if we think of a network of financial institutions, there's a connection between some institution in terms of the assets it issues, and then some other organization that holds its issues. And there's going to be assets that are assets to one and a liability to the other. This is basically the pyramid idea, but just with more complex linkages, basically.
Yeah.
The insight here is that if you think of a lot of these linkages going cross country, you could have financial institutions in one country
Yes.
holding assets denominated in another country or in another currency on its balance sheet. And so if there is monetary expansion, for example, in the US, now US institutions become more liquid. Now US institutions issue more assets themselves with
Yeah.
more liabilities to them. And
Yeah.
these assets get held, for example, by European banks.
Yeah.
Now some of this liquidity spills over, right? Now this is on the balance sheets of a lot of European banks. They become more liquid. And even if the ECB does nothing,
Yeah.
well, maybe they're able to issue now more liabilities themselves that provide liquidity services. And so what you're going to see is that US inflation is going to spill over into a lot of other places. This is exactly what we see, right? This literature has been observed for a long time, but we saw this very dramatically after COVID,
Yeah.
that a lot of places, the whole world, with some high inflation exceptions, whole world had been struggling to get inflation up.
Yes.
And then after COVID, all of them get, kind of overshoot to a
Yeah.
large extent. Is that because all of the central banks are doing the same kind of monetary policy at the
Yeah.
same time? I mean,
Yes.
to some extent, it was COVID. There was big
Yeah.
fiscal accommodation,
Yeah.
but also because a lot of these linkages go across countries and liquidity will spill over.
Yes.
And that's something that central banks are going to have to be aware of in terms of international monetary policy coordination.
Yeah. Yes. You actually linking this with some potential lines of research that one can pursue, given the fact that the development of liquid financial instruments, have taken place over the course of business cycle, right? And so you call for identifying the particular shocks that affect the switch in particular bubbles from stabilizing to destabilizing speculation, right, Cameron?
Yeah, because what's going on in this network structure, right? One unproductive response that some, for example, narrow banking advocates call for, they say that, well, we got all these uh, liquid assets being issued by private organizations.
Yeah,
This makes monetary policy harder. And so let's reinstitute something like Regulation Q. Let's split apart these hybrid assets between investment and liquidity.
mhm,
And that's supposed to make monetary policy easier. First of all, I don't even think that's true. There's a nice Bologna and Ireland paper where they show that that's not true. In fact, what that does is it's going to distort the structure, right?
okay,
You're not going to get some smooth sides of the pyramid where you have, kind of a smooth gradient of liquidity. You can choose how much investment, how much liquidity, and vary that smoothly. If you make that a step, if you make that a big discrete step, you've made people's lives worse, right? You've taken away options from people. And what you've
yes,
also done is you've made it necessary if somebody wants to move
yes,
from here to here, now they got to make a big jump
yeah,
rather than a small jump, right?
yes,
And so the problem with financial repression as a solution to these endogenous dynamics is that it forces people to make these kind of big destabilizing jumps.
yeah,
Now, that being said, what this also does, I'm not going to say it makes monetary policy harder, but it does suggest that monetary policy is going to have to change priorities, which to some extent it already has, right?
yeah,
Part of the issue with some of these endogenous dynamics is that expectations can become self-feeding. You get kind of these positive feedback loops. When expectations become unanchored, all of a sudden the economy looks very unstable. It looks like you have animal spirits and things are going crazy, and you need the central bank to manage things very actively. I think that's generally a mistake because then we have to ask, why would expectations be self-feeding? And what we see is that when expectations become unanchored, especially when a central bank loses credibility as far as its monetary policy, as far as its future monetary policy, that's the situation where expectations become self-feeding. And
yeah,
so to maintain stability, suddenly honesty, credibility becomes much more important. And in during the gold standard was one way of ensuring the credibility of the future path of monetary policy, anchoring
yeah,
expectations.
yeah,
During the 70s and 80s, that was our experiment with unanchored expectations. Didn't go so well. And what we've discovered since the 80s, and especially since the 2000s, is that the credibility of the central bank in terms of setting expectations is critical. And it's more critical uh, a when we have this huge variety of assets satisfying liquidity needs because those are endogenously provided.
yeah,
And I think the central banks kind of realize this, even if they aren't thinking in terms of monetary aggregates, they do realize that credibility is important, that setting expectations is important. This is where we get forward guidance, for example. And this is a big part of a lot of the new Keynesian literature is the expectations, right? And if you nail down the expectations, then you can solve the new Keynesian model.
yeah,
And obviously, I think this would be better if they were looking at monetary aggregates as well. But the focus on the expectations, I think, is is a beneficial development in monetary policy over the past few decades.
Yeah, I think so Hayek has this book which is Monetary Theory and Trade Cycle. So I think
Monetary theory and what?
trade cycle.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So in one of the paragraphs, he actually says that the monetarist theorist should actually pursue a more profound and fundamental effect of the process by which money is introduced into the economic system.
Mhm.
And I think this is what we are failing to take account of, right? The effect of the process by which money is introduced in the banking system, right? And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
And even monetary theory and the trade cycle, what was that,
yeah, yeah,
1933?
yeah, yeah,
And just imagine how much more well-developed that and more profound that process is today than it was in 1933.
yeah, yeah. So I think this is where we would like to end. But then having discussed all this, any point, Cameron, that you feel that you can talk about as you wind up this.
Well, I do want to thank you for the thoughtful questions. I think we've had a lot of good things to talk about. Thank you for looking at the papers and really thinking about the arguments. I hope this has been interesting and useful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It certainly has been very interesting because I think it's very important to have a proper measure by which we define money, liquidity, investment, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so your paper have done that, and I think you're going to pursue this line of research going forward, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
And I hope I'll see some you've talked about doing a lot of empirical work on the basis of these
yeah,
kinds of theoretical this theoretical work, and I will look forward to seeing your
yeah,
future work too.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Same to you. Yeah. Thank you, Cameron. Thanks a
Have a
lot.
good evening.
Yeah. Thank you. Same to you. Yeah. Thank you.